David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So we have the latest jobs numbers, and once again, the latest jobs report has missed expectations, but I want to talk about it specifically in order really to have a conversation. I want to make more of an effort to go beyond just the latest numbers and to really make sure we're understanding the big issues that are underlying these jobs numbers and the systemic economic problems that are going to have to be solved if we're really going to progress as a society and progress as an economy for the sort of betterment and well-being of everybody in the country, on the planet, whatever. So as a starting point, let's quickly deal with the numbers themselves. New jobs, again, have slowed down. They fell short of expected numbers in May. Only 75,000 jobs were added in May. The expected number was 175,000. So number one, it's really important to understand that because more and more people live in the United States over time, and based on their ages, the number of working age people also fluctuates. But as a really general idea, you need to create some new jobs just to keep up with population growth. There are different estimates of what that number is. I've seen as low as 80,000 jobs a month. I've seen as high as 120,000 jobs a month. It's a complex and pretty widely contested number. And I know no matter what number or range I give, some people are going to disagree with me. But understand the concept. If 75,000 new jobs were created and you need 80,000 or 100,000 or 120,000 just to account for population growth, we're falling behind one way or the other. The only debate is how much are we falling behind when we only create 75,000 jobs. Now, the trend line is also a concern because we got below expected numbers for several months in a row. The numbers from March were revised down from the initial reports. March was initially reported at 189,000, and then the numbers were fine-tuned, and we found out it was actually 153,000 new jobs in March, which isn't great. April was reported as 263,000. It was fine-tuned, and then it turns out it was actually only 224,000 new jobs. So unemployment is at a historically low rate. New job numbers are falling short of expectations regularly now. Payrolls have ticked up slightly, but less than inflation, which is an important metric to consider. So if we step back and we say, how is the Trump jobs economy? It's more or less the trend line that we saw under Obama with some slowdown. It's basically a very similar trajectory, except it is slowing down to some degree. Now, how much of it is because of Trump? Some, but not all. Some of what Donald Trump has done is already certainly having an effect on the broader economic conditions. And then stepping back from that, there's sort of like a broader geopolitical circumstance that exists not in a vacuum, but sort of on a continuum, and that has carried on from the Obama presidency into the Trump presidency. Now, let's get to the really important stuff, because everything I've told you so far, it's important to know, but tracking these numbers will not and does not address the real problems that we have in the United States around working and labor and wages. I'll give you an example. Here's a problem. A ton of work in our economy is assigned no economic value and is treated as such, which has a whole number of different effects. So if you stay home to raise kids, or you take care of elderly parents instead of working, or you volunteer in work that strengthens our communities in ways that don't have a specifically assigned economic value, but obviously have value to the economy. If kids aren't raised in a good way, to use a really sort of vague general term, if kids aren't raised in a way that makes them good members of our communities, that has an economic cost. They are more likely to commit crime, which costs money in terms of police and property damage and whatever else. So you can understand how raising kids properly has an economic value, but it's hard to exactly assign a number to it. And if you can't do that in our economy, it's effectively valued at zero. That's a major problem. That's not addressed by looking at, did we have 150,000 or 200,000 jobs created? Issue number two, even when we look at wage growth, whether we have 0.2% wage growth or 5%, or we annualize it to 3, 4, or 5% wage growth or whatever, and we look at the numbers over the last 40 years, what you have to understand is that the lion's share of the mean wage growth that has taken place over the last many decades has gone disproportionately to the top. Almost all of the economic gains since 1980 have gone to the top half of earners rather than the bottom half of earners. A ton of it has gone to the top 1%. A crazy disproportionate amount has gone to the top 0.1%. So you can argue about Trump has 0.5% wage growth and Obama had 0.4 or whatever, but if most of it goes to the rich, it's not stimulating the economy as much as it could. It's making society more unequal, which increases crime and all sorts of other problems. That needs to be solved. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that bragging about we're up 0.2% in wages, or the unemployment rate has ticked up or down 0.1%, or 150,000 versus 160,000 job creation, it doesn't deal with these long-term systemic problems that when members of Congress are reelected every 2 years, when presidents are reelected every 4 years, and senators are reelected every 6, there is no baseline incentive to actually deal with that. And by the way, the political battle over the jobs reports doesn't touch inequality. It doesn't touch work that's valued at zero by the economy. And none of it deals with automation and technological unemployment and the fact that we're going to have to rethink human relationships to work. There are a ton of ideas around how do we think about technological unemployment and automation and robotics and artificial intelligence. We've heard about universal basic income. We've heard about government guaranteed jobs programs, negative income tax rates. The most important question is going to be who gets the gains from technology if nothing changes in our economic system? And we know the answer. The huge corporations and the rich people who buy the robots and the automation technology and the artificial intelligence infrastructures, they are going to get the gains, which is going to make the country more unequal. It's not going to do demand side stimulus, meaning giving people money that they can spend. Imagine a company with 100 employees and the technology that lets them double productivity. There are lots of ways to distribute the gains. A pure capitalism solution might be the company fires 50 people and they're able to keep producing the same amount of stuff with half the employees because of this great technology. It's terrible for the economy. 50 people are now out of a job. They don't have money with which they can go and buy things from other companies. So those other companies that want to be selling stuff to those 50 people lose out. And those other companies end up having to let people go. So that's not good. Like a pure free market capitalism solution for technological unemployment and automation technology is not good. The employer could also say, instead of firing 50 people, we'll keep all 100 people, but now with this new technology that doubles productivity, each employee only has to work 20 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week, and they can all keep making the same amount of money, and the capitalist, so to speak, the ownership, the business, doesn't get any of the gains. Now, companies aren't going to do that. A fair solution would be that the company gets a little bit of those gains because they're buying the new technology, but the workers also get some of it. I don't know exactly what the numbers would be, but that would be sort of a solution from the world of social democracy. But as you can see, there has to be regulation in order to prevent the company from just taking all the gains and firing half of their workforce. And that's just one of the problems that needs to be solved. So my message to you today is that we can't take any politician seriously that isn't talking about the deeper issues: job creation numbers, unemployment rates, wage growth, these ideas of we're going to bring back manufacturing. These are surface issues that if we solve are effectively Band-Aids in our economic system. If a candidate isn't talking about restructuring the economic system, changing the relationship of humans to work, dealing with inequality in a serious way, dealing with the economic activities that are not valued at all by our current economy. And then also, by the way, dealing with activities that are profitable for lots of people, but actually aren't economically valuable. If you look at a ton of what the financial world's derivative instruments and speculation do, they can't actually be taken seriously as drivers of economic value in a long-term way. A lot of that stuff that's going on Wall Street merely serves to enrich people without actually providing any stimulus to the economy. So if politicians aren't talking about that stuff, if they're talking merely about, I'll bring back manufacturing jobs or whatever else, I don't take them seriously, and you shouldn't take them seriously either. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Robert Turner and Tracy Copeland. Robert and Tracy, really appreciate your support. There has been a crazy influx of new paid members since my appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience last week. Absolutely unbelievable. Dozens and dozens of new members signing up. And it's a great thing. It's a great thing. And I hope that it continues. And I hope I keep welcoming people like Robert and Tracy as new members. Also want to say thanks to Randall McMahon. Randall has been a member since 2014, almost 5 years, and he's today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Donald Trump has had the luxury of being the owner and boss basically since the beginning of his career. And one of the great things about being the owner and boss is that in a sense, you can't get fired. Now, I know that if you're the CEO of a publicly traded company and there's a board of directors, you might be the founder and you might be the majority shareholder, the plurality owner rather, not majority shareholder, but you might still be forced to step down as CEO, for example. And there are some cases in which you can be the founder and the boss and still get fired. But in many situations outside of publicly traded companies, you're effectively immune from getting fired if you're the one in charge. I can't be fired from the David Pakman Show, for example. I'm the majority shareholder. There's no board of directors. Every paid member could quit. Every viewer could stop watching. We could end up with effectively no show. I could just be sitting here doing videos that nobody sees, but I can't be fired in a sense. And that is not typical. In most jobs, your behavior on and off the job can get you fired. And I was thinking over the weekend that Donald Trump's behavior at any other job where he is not the owner of the company or the person in charge would have absolutely gotten him fired by now. Donald Trump has publicly insulted countless world leaders, sort of equivalent to being our business partners, we can say, in a sense. If anybody ranging from a low-level employee to the CEO were to publicly insult their company's clients or their customers or their partners in the way that Donald Trump has insulted the leaders of other world countries, they would have been fired by now. The highest law enforcement agencies in the country did an investigation into Donald Trump, and they found substantial evidence of criminality on 8 of 14 possible obstruction counts. At any other job, those results from a criminal investigation would obviously get you fired. And most people would also be indicted and facing prison time right now. But Trump's the boss or the owner or whatever role he has as president of the United States of America. He's apparently immune there as well. And then there's a whole other sort of angle on this. George Conway, who's an attorney and the husband of Kellyanne Conway, who is one of Donald Trump's closest advisors. George Conway is a big Trump opponent. And he pointed out something else, which is that someone having the apparent mental health issues that Donald Trump is having would also have been let go from any other job based on his behavior. Tweeting over the weekend, quote, "You're not presidential at all, period. You're mentally unwell. You engage in bizarre, irrational, self-defeating behavior, which prompts criticism of you, which triggers more bizarre, irrational, self-defeating behavior. You would have been fired from any other job by now." Trump's behavior is the type that would get the bosses together to say, this person needs to go. Let's figure out how to get them out of here with the least amount of drama possible. And we could actually go further. If anybody exhibited Donald Trump's behavior during the campaign in the hiring process for a job, they would never even get hired in the first place. And this is what happens when instead of a 3-person hiring committee, including the CEO, someone from HR, and a supervisor gets to decide who to hire, when it's instead left up to the American people, American voters, 60 million of whom are right-wing Republicans, this is exactly what you end up with. Over the weekend, I was talking to a friend who's dealing with a very similar situation at work. They have a coworker who started writing outrageous, aggressive emails, including to their supervisors, talking back to management, straight up saying they're not going to be doing certain things because, as they see it, it doesn't make sense to do it, and telling the supervisors that, taking offense to anything that's said around them. And management is trying to figure out, we need to get rid of this person, but we also need to do it in a way that is not going to create even more absolute and total chaos. That's the distinction with Donald Trump. Any normal person who behaved during the hiring process the way Donald Trump behaved during the campaign would not have been hired. Any person who behaved at their job the way Donald Trump has behaved since becoming president of the United States would have been fired. But the one advantage is we can just vote Trump out, okay? People can just go vote and Trump has to leave, period, in January of 2021. And my ask of you is the following. As atrocious and disastrous as Donald Trump is, we shouldn't forget that Trump is an effect, not a cause. Now, yeah, Donald Trump's presidency has caused a lot of bad things. He's ruined relationships with allies. He's weaponized ignorance. He's weaponized hypocrisy. But Trump's presidency is the result of the last 30 years, not a cause in and of itself. So remember that getting rid of Trump doesn't actually solve the problem, although it's still something that we should do. But also understand the sort of proximate causes that led to Donald Trump, which is exactly what I want to talk about next on the show, because it's so important and a lot of people are missing the boat on this. So let's expand on the reality that Donald Trump is not the problem, but is a symptom. I've said this before, and I've never devoted a whole segment to it that I can remember, but I think it's an important time to discuss this as we're starting to ramp up in the 2020 election. And now we're getting beyond just executive orders that could be quickly reversed by the next president. We're really now at a point at which there has been irreversible harm done by the presidency of Donald Trump. When we look today at Donald Trump's presidency, and we look at the United States, and we look at our increasingly laughable role in world politics under Donald Trump, and we look at countries around the world increasingly excluding the United States from serious discussions because Donald Trump just can't be the adult in the room that our former president was, even if you disagreed with him on policy. I understand that it can get really easy and simple to just say Donald Trump is the problem. Trump is a problem. And I've told you every time that I tell you that Donald Trump has done something that's bad, there's no question that Donald Trump is a problem. With Trump, he really is, most importantly, though, the end result of the problems, not the problem in and of itself at a kind of broader systemic level. And I know that a lot of you already sort of have an idea about some of the ways in which this is true and could probably explain to me some of the ways in which Donald Trump is a symptom rather than the problem himself. But there are actually more examples than we've ever discussed. Number one, Trump partially won, partially is an important word, because of anti and pseudo-intellectualism. I've said this before. Trump didn't create an electorate that is increasingly proud of their ignorance and sees higher education as inherently left-wing nonsense and liberal indoctrination. Trump benefited from the American right pushing anti-intellectualism for decades. Trump benefited from a right-wing electorate that doesn't care about double standards and hypocrisy and immorality on the basis of their own moral code. He benefited from that, but he didn't create it. Now, I've given that example before, and it's not new. And a lot of times people will write to me and they'll say, David, you're just saying Trump voters are stupid. It's sort of an ad hominem. It's not really an important and serious and thorough analysis of what's going on. Well, it's accurate And that's what I care most about, even if some people don't like it, but it's just one piece. Let me give you another example of how Trump is a symptom and not the problem in and of itself. Donald Trump has weaponized xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant, nationalist red meat, the likes of which we've been seeing him throw out to his followers since he announced his candidacy back in 2015, I guess it was. If there isn't already some of this repressed desire for Trump's rhetoric, Trump throwing that xenophobic, whatever red meat out isn't going to work. It's not going to help get him elected. Donald Trump did not create racist, anti-immigrant, nationalist sympathies in the American right. What he was able to do is weaponize and coalesce lots of what was being thought by American right-wingers, but not typically said or not always said, because they sort of realize that there's a contingent of America which rightly is turned off by that type of rhetoric. Those sympathies existed before Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't create those sympathies. And if they didn't exist, Trump wouldn't have been able to take advantage of them. So this is another way in which Donald Trump is a symptom of the problem and an end result, not the problem in and of itself. But let's keep going, okay? Because very often the analyses stop here. And so far, it's just been examples of how the right has fomented the circumstances that led to Trump. And they have. But the left is not totally innocent here either. The left, as a really bad alternative to the right for a lot of the last 20 years, also enabled Donald Trump to win. I'm not blaming Democrats, okay? Understand what it is that I mean. The Democratic Party has been a slightly left of center party overall, okay? There are exceptions. Overall, for the last 2 decades or more, the Democratic Party has at the national level, by and large, been a slightly left of center party. The DNC and the Democratic Party, corporate Democrats, so to speak, have unsuccessfully tried to compromise with an American right wing that doesn't compromise. They've played the sort of milquetoast, slightly to the left of Republicans alternative for decades, with some exceptions, of course. They have mostly still been part of the neoliberal, centrist status quo force that has only recently sort of started to wake up to the reality that we've got to deal with systemic inequality. Healthcare needs to be radically changed at a systemic level. The foreign policy of the United States needs a complete and total overhaul. We need to rethink the economy. We need to rethink all sorts of stuff. So when the alternative to Republicans has been for decades mostly a Democratic Party that is basically a slightly more progressive but widely impotent alternative that apologizes for being slightly left and often runs as Republican light, that has also helped millions of voters say, let's just give Trump a shot. Okay, when both Democratic and Republican presidents for a long time haven't improved on the fundamental economic frustrations that most Americans have, other than dealing with it around the edges for the lower and middle class, of course that's going to get some people to say, what the hell, let's just try Donald Trump. Now, this is not a defense of Trump voters. This is not a defense of right-wing ideology. This is not a criticism of every individual Democrat or policy idea from the Democratic Party. What I'm pointing out is the reality that the right has done a really good job of creating the conditions in which Donald Trump could do what he did by appealing to these base, unsophisticated, anti-intellectual movements and ideas of the right. But the Democratic Party hasn't been left enough or strong enough or principled enough to be the obvious right choice to more of America over a totally ignorant clown like Trump. Now, I know a lot of you will write in and say, David, a lot of those right-wing voters are so ignorant and so ideological, and they just care about abortion, the evangelicals anyway, that it doesn't matter what the Democratic Party does. Either way, they weren't going to vote for Democrats. I agree that that applies to a lot of the Republican Party, but this election came down to 77,000 votes in 3 states. There is no way that you are going to convince me, and I don't think there is an empirical case to be made, that if the Democratic Party didn't seem like what it has been for the last several decades, that 77,000 votes wouldn't have gone a different way if it was made abundantly clear all along that this is not Republican light. It's not a slightly more pro-social version of Republicans at the national level. So Trump voting out should happen. Trump either has a year and a half left or 5.5 years left. We don't know. Eventually, Trump's going to be gone. There's going to be real damage that Donald Trump did, which the next person, whoever it is going to have to clean up. If Trump gets reelected in 2020, it'll be more damage than if he's removed in 2020. But there's no undoing the reality that we now know you can weaponize all of the worst instincts and ideas and sympathies of the American right. And conservatives are to blame for most of it, but the Democratic Party is not innocent here. And it's really important that we not forget that. I hope you're listening carefully and realize I'm not doing the both sides are the same. I'm not doing both sides are equally to blame, because they're not. But the Democratic establishment is not innocent in the rise of Trump. If you look at their behavior over the last 20 to 30 years, the circumstances that led to Trump are many, and Democrats have a piece of that responsibility. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me what I'm missing, and make sure to subscribe to both the YouTube channel and the podcast to support the work that we do. A lot of behind the scenes pictures from my trip to Los Angeles last week, which included an appearance on the Joe Rogan program. Follow the show on Instagram at David Pakman Show, and follow me while you're there at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today David Wallace Wells, who's a national fellow at the New America Foundation, columnist and deputy editor at New York Magazine, and author of the book, The Uninhabitable Earth. David, great to talk to you today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
So let's just dive right into it. Increasingly, there have been both sort of sober and specific claims about how long until the Earth may become inhabitable, what uninhabitability means, like what do we really mean when we say that? And there have also been some sort of very erratic caricaturizations of some of the claims that have been made about this that are often not based in science. So if we're even going to start thinking about this issue, like what would it mean for the Earth to be uninhabitable? What are the metrics, or how should we be thinking about what that would even look like or mean? How would we know if the Earth was, quote, uninhabitable?
Well, technically, it would mean that no humans were able to live on it. And I think that we're very, very far from having that be the situation we're living in. I mean, probably even in a complete worst case scenario where everything goes absolutely haywire and we don't do anything to adjust our consumption patterns or production of carbon, we're probably talking about several centuries at the absolute fastest. So it's not a scenario that is coming in the near term, but what is coming quite close is the devastation of particular parts of the planet, many of which are now quite densely inhabited, which could make them much, much harder to live in. So as soon as 2050, many scientists who study the direct heat effects of global warming, which is to say literally how much the human body can take, how much temperature and humidity the human body can take before risking heat stroke and possibly heat death, say that many of the biggest cities in South Asia and the Middle East would be so hot in summer that you wouldn't really be able to go outside during the day. You certainly wouldn't be able to work outside during the day without risking heat stroke. And these are cities that today hold 10, 12, 15 million people. And it's possible that as soon as 2050, which may sound a little far away, but is just the length of an American mortgage from now, those cities would literally not be able to support human life in the way that we understand it today, which is one reason why the UN expects that also by 2050, we could have as many as 200 million climate refugees or possibly more.
Right. So what we're talking about, in a sense, is the underestimating that is taking place as to the effects of climate change. When we're talking about habitability, we're talking about parts of the planet, we're talking about in particular ways. I mean, some that I think of are sea level rise, putting certain cities underwater. It's not the Earth is uninhabitable, but we're sort of being pushed further inland in some sense. When we talk about pollution from industrialization and continued burning of fossil fuels, it's not uninhabitable, but it's how much technology are we going to need just to be able to breathe when we go outdoors, or will we not be able to go outdoors at a certain point? What are some of the other ways that in the immediate we should be thinking about these restraints on the habitability of parts of the planet?
Well, actually, air pollution is one that I find really striking. There was a major study I talk about a lot in 2018 looking at just the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. And to give your audience a sense, we're already at 1.1 degrees of warming above what's called the pre-industrial average. That puts us already outside the entire window of temperatures that enclose all of human history. So the Earth is now already warmer than it's ever been during the entire history of humanity, stretching back all through the time in which we evolved, we developed agriculture and civilization and modern civilization, so that you can think of really everything we know about human life as having developed under climate conditions that already are out of date. That's where we are now, 1.1 degrees of warming. We're on track for about 4.3 degrees of warming. But just between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, these scientists estimated just through the impact of air pollution, which is not narrowly a result of climate change, but is produced by the same thing that produces climate change, which is to say the burning of fossil fuels. They estimated air pollution would kill 153 million additional people. And when I tell that to audiences, when I tell that to interviewers, when I tell that to friends, their faces go ashen, their eyes go wide. They think, my God, this is a completely unconscionable level of suffering. It's death at the scale of 25 Holocausts. And they're right, it is unconscionable. And yet, 9 million people are already dying every year from the effects of air pollution. So we're already turning away from some of these impacts today, even though we might like to think that we wouldn't turn away from them and we would find a moral obligation to address them. We see already that we're dealing with many of these impacts without doing much to address them at all. And to take another example, I recently wrote a piece for New York Magazine about the California wildfires. I spoke to Eric Garcetti, the mayor of LA. He's 48 years old. The year he was born, 60,000 acres of forest burned in California. The year he was elected mayor, 2013, it was 600,000, a tenfold increase. The year he was re-elected mayor in 2017, it was 1.2 million acres, which means twice as much as had just been the case 4 years before. And last year, 2018, 1.9 million acres burned. So these trajectories are inescapable to anyone who lives in California. And the scientists say that, again, just by 2050, which is, again, if you're buying a home in California, it's just the length of a mortgage from now. Just by 2050, scientists expect that wildfires will get at least twice as bad and maybe 4 times as bad as they are now. And in the second half of the century, the estimates are even more dramatic. There is some responsible science, I think it's a little high, but there's some responsible science that says that by the end of the century, 2100, wildfires in California could get 64 times worse, which would mean something like 75% of the state of California would be burning every single year. Now, again, I think that there are reasons to think that those numbers are a little high, but they give you a sense of just how dramatically transformed the planet can be by even one of these impacts. And there are so many that you can't even count them, hurricanes, extreme weather, drought, famine, the public health issues that arise when mosquitoes that used to be trapped in the tropics are flying as far north as the Arctic Circle, as will be the case very shortly. There's a relationship between temperature and war, so that for every half degree of warming, those who study it suggest that we would get between 10 and 20% increase of conflict. So if we end up at 4 degrees at the end of the century, which is what we're on track for, we could have twice as much war as we have today. And there's a major impact on economic growth, so that by the end of the century, 2100, we could be dealing with at least 20% smaller, perhaps 30% smaller global GDP than we would have without climate change. 30% is an impact that's twice as big as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. There would be parts of the planet that would be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. So this is a sort of inescapable, all-encompassing threat. I look at these impacts, and they seem really dramatic. They seem terrifying, as they should be. I also think that we'll find a way to adapt and live among some of these impacts, but what it will mean for the way that we organize our societies, the way that we organize our politics, how much empathy we extend to those around the world, these are really big open questions. I think they may be as profound as the ones about direct climate impacts. And we haven't really yet begun to think about just how scrambled our lives will be by this force, which is, I think, as big and all-encompassing a force as, say, modernity was in the 19th century, or, you could say financial capitalism was in the late 20th. It will dominate this coming century in ways that we don't even yet know how to anticipate.
When I cover this stuff, I want to be as precise and accurate as possible. as someone who lives in the United States, about how bad or not bad of an actor the U.S. climate skepticism, climate denial sort of status quo is in the grand scheme of things. And there are obviously lots of reasons to think that the United States is a bad actor here, and acutely so. There are some defenses, like, for example, listen, most of the carbon is not being burned in the U.S., even though disproportionately it is being burned in the U.S. In sort of raw numbers, it's not. The U.S. is just one player. Even though these other countries are doing some stuff, they're still just trying to slow the growth of the problem rather than actually reduce the size of the problem. How bad of an actor is the U.S. in all of this?
It really depends on your perspective. So, I think it's important for everyone to understand the U.S. is now producing about 15% of carbon emissions globally. That puts us in second place, which is not a good place to be. But China is producing about twice as much. They're at 28% of global carbon emissions today. That's one perspective. But another perspective is historically, so how much we're responsible for putting the carbon up in the atmosphere to begin with. And from that perspective, the U.S. is responsible for actually, I think, over the majority of all carbon emissions that have ever been produced by humanity. So in that sense, we have a kind of, there's a moral imperative for us to act, even if today we're doing better than some other nations in the world. In terms of, denial and skepticism, I personally think that those forces are completely villainous. I think that the fossil fuel companies are doing great damage to the future of the planet, and the way that they've captured at least the perspective of one of the two parties in the U.S. is a tragedy and an outrage. On the other hand, when you look around the world at countries where fossil fuel interests have much less political power,
yes,
and governments that are much more committed to green policies, at least rhetorically, basically none of them are doing any better in terms of reducing carbon emissions than the U.S. is. And that makes me think that the problem here may be a bit deeper than simply the force of denial or climate skepticism, and that we may be distracting ourselves and sort of giving ourselves a pat on the back when we needn't, as American liberals, when we point the finger at the other side and say it's all their fault. I think, the UK is doing a bit better than the US is. There are a few countries in the EU that are doing a little bit better. But, it's generally speaking, we signed the Paris Accords 3 years ago. All of the countries of the world, no major country in the world is on track to meet those commitments.
Right.
Even if all of them did, we'd still be on track for north of 3 degrees of warming this century, which would be completely catastrophic by almost every metric. The only nations in the entire world that are even compatible at this point with the goals of the Paris Accords are Morocco and Gambia. 2 countries, that's it. So I think we're dealing with a much, much bigger problem than simply the force of denial in the U.S., and the way that the Republican Party has been captured by those forces. On the other hand, I don't want to let those people off the hook, because I think they're very much fighting on the wrong side of history and doing a kind of moral damage to the country and the world, even if, practically speaking, I think that their role is a bit overstated sometimes.
So you said a few minutes ago that you do think that in the face of all of these coming negative consequences, that we will in many ways find ways to cope. But I want to sort of go a step further than that, which is to say, is the fact that you chose to have a kid while writing this book a sign that, in a more general sense, you're optimistic that this is something humans will deal with appropriately?
I think of myself as an optimist, yes. I mean, I think it's really important to keep in mind to think about what you're basing your expectations off of. So if you're hoping that the world is going to stay roughly as it is today, which is already a quite degraded climate where 500-year storms have hit Houston in the last 3 years, or we've had those catastrophic wildfires, these unprecedented heat waves, the biggest storm in 50 years to hit Mozambique, followed by an even bigger storm less than a month later. All these kinds of impacts that would have been unconscionable just a generation ago, we're already in that kind of unprecedented, harrowing climate situation. And if you're hoping to preserve this climate, that terrible, damaged climate, even that, I think, is hopeless. There's no way that we're going to stabilize the climate and anything like our present situation, which means, from that perspective, that's a strong argument for pessimism. But I like to think that our best baseline of expectation is the track we're headed on, which is to say 4 degrees of warming. And I think there's quite a lot that we can do and will do to avert that level of warming. I think it's really important to keep in mind when I talk about some of these really catastrophic impacts, the wildfires, the economic impacts, the twice as much war, all that stuff. These impacts can seem overwhelmingly large, but they're also a reminder that we have power over the climate. They're a reflection of our power over the climate. If we get to that 4-degree level and we're dealing with all of those impacts, it will be because of what we do from here through the end of the century. That means that our hands are on those levers and we can theoretically change course. Theoretically, there are a lot of human obstacles in the way that are preventing us, or at least slowing down that action. But theoretically, it's up to us to write the story of this, of our near future. And I think, part of the reason that I had a child, I think partly it's that I'm living in delusion and compartmentalization like so many other people, and want to live my life as I want to live it, as so many other people do, not thinking about these issues. But to the extent that I was focused on the climate question and thinking about the choice to have a child, I think, I was very mindful of the fact that this story is not yet written. It is up to us to write it. And a huge range of outcomes are possible, from a little bit worse than we have today to quite dramatically worse. And I think on climate, as with everything, you have to fight for the kind of world that you want to live in and you want your loved ones to live in, rather than giving up before the story has even been written, has been determined. And I think for all those reasons, I think it's up to us, and we should, seize the opportunities for optimism and for action, rather than retreating into fatalism and despair. Because the truth is, even though the climate as we know it today is already gone, there's no hope for saving it, the story is not at all over yet. And we fall into a trap often, thinking of climate as a binary system, where it's either there's no climate change or climate change is here, or it's livable or it's catastrophic. But it's a spectrum, and every tick upward of temperature that we get is going to make life worse, with more pain and more suffering around the world, most of it concentrated in the global south. But every tick upward that we can avoid means that life will be better, healthier, more prosperous. And I think we owe it to all of us and our children and grandchildren to fight for that future as much as we can every day.
The book is called The Uninhabitable Earth. We've been speaking with the book's author, David Wallace Wells, who's also a national fellow at the New America Foundation and columnist and deputy editor at New York Magazine. David, really appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So something as serious as the impeachment of a sitting president really shouldn't depend on public opinion. There have been 2 impeachments of presidents, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Neither was ultimately convicted by the Senate, but it's still really serious stuff. If impeachment is the right thing based on the facts, both Republicans and Democrats should do it regardless of party and regardless of public opinion. Now, that's idealism, and it's not based in reality. It's not the system that we have. Our elected officials are highly partisan on what even is worthy of impeachment. They're also completely influenced by what the public wants at any particular point in time. And a really great example is to look at Richard Nixon's resignation. Nixon resigned because he was going to get impeached. He was going to get impeached because Democrats and Republicans in his own party were going to impeach him. And there was bipartisan impeachment support in the House and Senate because there was more and more public support from both sides for impeachment. So that brings us to 2019. And in Donald Trump's case in 2019, Republicans, at least for the time being, still don't want to impeach Donald Trump, and Democrats do. But support among independent voters has doubled since May, or almost doubled since April, rather. Back in April, 14% of independents said we should impeach Donald Trump. There's a new Marist NPR PBS NewsHour poll where independent support for impeaching Trump has almost doubled from 14% in April to 23% now, almost doubled in 2 or 3 months, 2 months. This is huge for 2 different reasons. And neither is that Trump is actually going to be impeached and removed before the November election. He's not. Okay, that's not the goal. We should set our expectations correctly, as I suggested we do a week or 2 ago. Independents doubling their support of Donald Trump being impeached is huge because it's pushed total support of impeachment nationally over 50% to 52%. That is huge, okay? This is starting to be a historical high. 52% of the country believes that the president of the United States should be impeached and removed from office. That's massive, and we have, by and large, independents to thank for it because both Democratic and Republican support for impeachment has stayed roughly the same for several months. The second reason that impeachment support doubling among independents is huge is that it means independents themselves are moving away from Trump for the 2020 election. And that could end up making the difference in terms of who actually wins in November of 2020, because we know that Democrats aren't voting for Trump mostly. We know Republicans are voting for Trump mostly. I know that every election we say independents, oh, they're going to make it. How will they vote? All of that stuff. They're really going to be the difference makers. If support for impeaching Trump doubles among independents, it is very reasonable to think that just a few percent of independents have shifted from a Trump vote for 2020 to a not Trump vote in 2020 in the last couple of months. And that's bad for Trump in 2020. And I want to backtrack one second here and refresh about, if impeachment conviction isn't the goal, why is it that we want impeachment proceedings? The whole point here is to publicize the content of the Mueller report, okay? The Mueller report found substantial evidence that Donald Trump obstructed on 8 of 14 counts that the Mueller report looked at. We need public impeachment hearings. We need testimony. We need the content of the Mueller report publicized. We need all of it. It will not get Republicans to convict Donald Trump and remove him before November of 2020 unless something incredibly unpredictable happens. I just don't see it happening. It will, however, pierce the echo chamber of those who believed the entire Barr letter, no collusion, no obstruction propaganda talking point. Most people in the Fox News bubble have no idea how disastrously damaging the content of the Mueller report was, because most people in the Fox News bubble, and by the way, a lot of Americans in general, haven't actually read the content of the Mueller report. Impeachment hearings will expose that. It was 77,000 votes in 3 states that led to Donald Trump defeating Hillary Clinton in 2016. Those impeachment proceedings, starting with the inquiry, most importantly, should start right away, and all of this information should be publicized. If you think I'm wrong, let me know. Donald Trump appears totally off the rails in a recent series of tweets about the moon and Mars. The tweets are as bonkers as they are hypocritical, neither of which is a shock from the current president. Now, I've been talking about space exploration and NASA funding forever on this program. And sadly, there's a big part of the country that just doesn't see the importance of space exploration. And there's another part of the country that likes space exploration, but only as a military industrial complex sort of testing ground for new weapons and military tech, or as part of expanding American empire and colonialism to space. But in reality, exploring space is a really important thing for humans, an important endeavor for humans to undertake. The ambition and curiosity element are part of it, but that's kind of a more general thing. There's a life-saving component, right? Having the ability to save huge numbers of people from asteroids and comets, but by being able to deflect them, could be a really big thing for humanity in the future, depending on how long we think humans can stay on planet Earth. At a certain point, we're going to need some other place to go if Homo sapiens is going to continue existing. Earth is not going to be home to humans forever. It'll probably still be home for a long time, but if we want a place to eventually go, we need to be exploring space. Space exploration could lead to huge developments in mitigating climate change. We don't know what's out there and what we might find and what developments might stem from there. So anyway, Republicans sometimes want to explore space, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they want to do it, but only with private industry instead of NASA. Sometimes NASA is okay. And Donald Trump tweeted over the weekend that we shouldn't go to the moon and that the moon is part of Mars. I guess he means like in a more general sense of space exploration. Donald Trump tweeting very strangely, quote, "For all of the money we are spending, NASA should not be talking about going to the moon. We did that 50 years ago. They should be focused on the much bigger things we are doing, including Mars, of which the moon is a part, defense and science." Trump later tweeting also that moon pie is not really made of moon rocks, right? Under the category of what is extraordinarily obvious. So the immediate reaction was, is Trump saying that the moon is part of Mars? What is wrong with this guy? What the hell is going on? He's weaponized ignorance. Now, all of those reactions are true and accurate, but I don't think Trump thinks the moon is part of Mars. I believe what Donald Trump is trying to say here is something like the moon is part of the eventual Martian project. Going to the moon in and of itself is a means and not an end, or something like that. I mean, I don't exactly know what he was trying to say, but the most important thing is that this is the opposite of what Donald Trump said 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Donald Trump tweeted on May 13th, "Under my administration, we are restoring NASA to greatness, and we are going back to the moon, then Mars. I am updating my budget to include an additional $1.6 billion so that we can return to space in a big way." But then over the weekend, he says NASA should not be talking about going to the moon. We did that 50 years ago. We should be exploring space, no matter what Donald Trump says. We should be funding it. So much technology has come as a derivative from space exploration. And as far as Donald Trump's tweets here, I don't think he literally believes the moon is part of Mars. I think that we should stop trying to read so much into his tweets. These are the rantings of an ignorant and unstable person, period. If you imagine, being on the Boston or New York subway, for example, which I've had the privilege of doing hundreds of times, you don't necessarily try to read into the specifics of what the guy urinating in the back of the subway car is saying about Jesus is coming, right? You don't. You recognize it for what it is. You understand the context and you say, it's not really worth trying to read into so specifically. I think we increasingly need to see Donald Trump's tweets in sort of the same way. These are the erratic, unhinged things that occur to Donald Trump and that he tweets before anybody can actually talk sense into him. I don't know exactly what he meant by the moon is part of Mars. What I do know is that in just 3.5 weeks, Donald Trump appears to have completely done a 180 on whether we should be doing this space exploration and whether we should be going to the moon. And that's the real concern. And that's the concern geopolitically when Donald Trump's whims change and it makes it so that other countries can't see the United States as a reliable negotiating partner, as a reliable partner in all sorts of different ways, which they rightly can't under Donald Trump, because as we've seen with the Iran deal, he will on a whim say, even though Iran hasn't violated it, I'm just going to bail out. That's the real danger here. Does Trump think the moon is a piece of Mars? I don't think so. But who knows what Trump really actually thinks. I'm curious what you think Trump meant by this tweet. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is once again a caller absolutely destroying me on something that I actually never said and does not even align with my political ideology. What am I talking about? I'm talking about socialism and Venezuela. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David Packman, won't you just move on over to Venezuela and quit preaching your socialist bullshit? Because that's what you are, a socialist. And socialism is ain't nothing a bunch of damn communist bullshit. And on top of all that, it killed over 100 million people. But I don't guess you know that because you're a socialist and you're...
Yeah, got cut off there. Listen, I've made it abundantly clear that I'm not a socialist, and I've been extraordinarily critical of the Venezuela regime under Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro. So criticize me for stuff I've said. And interestingly, even after the Joe Rogan appearance last week, on which I said my perspective here is not a socialist perspective. I'm a social democrat, which is a mixed economy. It's a type of well-regulated capitalism. I still got a ton of emails and tweets. And if you look at the comments on the Joe Rogan interview, people saying, why did Joe Rogan have this socialist on to tout socialism? I'm not a socialist, okay? If you disagree with me on the policies I'm advocating, tell me why the policies are wrong. But to call them socialist and say that on that basis they are wrong or bad, I'm simply not a socialist. And if I were a socialist, I would be telling you. If there are many real serious critiques that can be made of this program. One that cannot be made is that I have been anything but completely open and genuine with the audience about what my views are. I'm a social democrat, not a socialist. If I were a socialist, I would tell you. If I were a free market capitalist, I would tell you, period. We've got a great bonus show planned for you today. We have some new things going on behind the scenes at the show, which I will tell you about. Former Red Sox player David Ortiz has been shot and hospitalized in the Dominican Republic. A very strange story and very sad. And the Boston mayor is saying that the city cannot stop the straight pride parade over the values that it espouses. We will talk about all of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get instant access. Takes under a minute to get instant access to the bonus show as a member at davidpakman.com/membership or as a patron at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.